A very common expression that we see mentioned throughout the Quran is that the servants of Allah will not fear and they will not have any grief. So for instance, in Surah 43, verse 68, Allah says, "O my servants, there is no fear for you this day and nor shall you grieve." Now in this lecture in particular, I just wanted to focus on the grief aspect of it. When it comes to grieving, we always grieve over things that have happened to us in the past. Tests, difficulties, calamities, hardships. At those moments in time, when we were really working hard towards a particular goal and we were making so much prayer and really asking Allah to help us achieve that goal, but for some reason we just were not able to. It could be your exams, it could be career, it could be linked to marriage, it could be linked to our different relationships, but whatever it is, there was something really hard that we were working towards and we just were not able to attain it because it was not the will of Allah. And so we simply end up grieving. We have sadness and depression. We have despair. And then, of course, we start asking all the questions that why did Allah not give me this one thing that I was asking Him for? Why did I have to face all these tests and difficulties? Why is it that my friends and, their lives are so amazing? And, everything just seems to be so easy for them. But when it comes to me, my life has always been so difficult. It's been so tough. And so gradually we start moving into that victim mentality, where we slowly move towards despair, we become hopeless, we have a lot of negative thoughts, and we just have this conviction, this very firm belief in our hearts that life is never going to get any better. And when family and friends come and they try to support us and they try to encourage us, we simply ignore everything that they're saying because we surround ourselves in this bubble of negativity. Now, of course, it's safe to say that each and every one of us has experienced this at some point in our lives. But the question is, that tests and difficulties came to people 1400 years ago as well. And even before that, if you look at the lives of all the prophets, they had immense tests and difficulties. So why is it that they did not fall into this victim mentality and into this bubble of depression? How is it that they were able to save themselves? Because I know that, one argument that we often give is that people in the past, when we look at the Sahabas and all of the prophets, their iman was so much stronger. So we don't like comparing ourselves with them at all. But what we do understand is that they were still human beings. They were not angels. They had a nafs, they had desires, they had emotions, anger, frustration, rage. They had the same kind of things that we actually feel. So the fact that despite being made up of the same components as us, they were somehow able to overcome this victim mentality and this grief and depression means that there must be something that they were practicing. There has to be something that they were doing which we are not. And that's why a good majority of our current generation seems to be filled with depression and anxiety, grief and stress, when people in the past were somehow able to overcome that. And then on top of that, what you see is that in the Quran, which has been made for mankind, it's been made for everyone till the end of times. If Allah keeps telling us that for the true believers, there will be no fear and no grief, He doesn't say for the prophets, He doesn't say for the Sahabas, He says for those who are true believers. And that gives us the indication that we can also be a true believer. So there has to be something that we're missing. And, by studying the Quran, we have to figure out what exactly was being done by the prophets and by the people in the past, and how can we mimic that behavior so that we can save ourselves from grief. When we study the Quran and all the different surahs and all the stories of the prophets, it really comes down to two very important things that was happening in the past, and that's not really happening right now. The first is that people in the past, the prophets as well as the Sahabas, they never played the blame game. And because of that, they never lived in the past. And this is really important. So they had a mindset where they would only look back in the past in order to learn from it and in order to figure out solutions so that their lives can become better. They were always looking forward. They were never living in the past. And we can also see this from the beautiful words of wisdom that we get from Hazrat Umar, radhiyallahu ta'ala anhu, where he said, don't grieve and don't look in the past unless it makes you stronger. So in other words, the people in the past, the true believers, they had what we call a growth mindset. It wasn't a fixed mindset. If they faced a setback or a failure, test or hardship, any kind of calamity, they would not use those tests or difficulties to define them. They would not have this feeling that now there is no solution left, my life will always be like this test or this calamity or this failure is basically defining who I am. And as a result, I will never be successful in life. They did not have that fixed mindset which moved them towards the victim mentality. They had a growth mindset. So every time they faced a setback or they faced some kind of a failure or some sort of a difficulty, they would understand that there are certain things that might have caused their setback, but they would never blame those things. And that's important because when you blame someone or when you blame your environment or your circumstance, you are basically projecting your failure onto someone or something else. And this is a very important distinction that we have to make between cause and effect relationships and the blame game. So in other words, imagine if there's a very close friend of yours, someone that you really trusted, and that person actually let you down. They harmed you in a certain way, they broke your trust, or they shared your secrets, and as a result, you're feeling very, very down, you're feeling very sad. Now, one option is you understand that, okay, the cause of your sadness is this individual because this individual ended up breaking your trust. Now, this is actually a very healthy mindset. In other words, you are very conscious of the fact that you are feeling down, and you are also aware of why you are feeling down. So it's not like people ask you, okay, why are you depressed? Why are you feeling so sad? And you just say, I have no idea. You are perfectly aware of why you are feeling this particular emotion. And when you are aware of the cause, you can therefore work on trying to prevent it from ever happening to you again. But instead, if you were to blame the individual, now you have found yourself a perfect scapegoat. This is not a healthy mindset. This is you moving towards a victim mentality where you have told yourself basically that from now on, every time I face a setback or a failure or any kind of problem, I can simply look back at this individual and blame it on him. I can say, because this person hurt me several months ago or several years ago, that's why today I have faced a setback. You can see this instant victim mentality that starts when you blame other people or your circumstances for your setbacks instead of seeing them as a cause. So you are telling yourself that because I cannot go back into the past and change these people, because I cannot go back into the past and change the harm that was done to me, I am basically stuck. And now today, whatever I have become, it is as a result of the harm that was done. So you are using the failure, the harm, the bad things that were done to you, you are using that to define who you are. This is the problem really of playing the blame game, because it makes you start to live in the past where you are always thinking about what has happened to you. You always use that as an excuse for whatever you're going through right now, and you're never really able to look forward. You're never able to have that growth mindset where you say, okay, these setbacks have happened to me, but now how am I supposed to improve? What are the solutions? How do I use that intellect that Allah has given me and come up with a way of improving myself? That part is something that you just choose not to focus on. And let me just give you these amazing examples from the Quran of the prophets so that we can understand that they were human beings too, but they chose to have a growth mindset. So for instance, when you look at Muhammad, peace be upon him, he's become a prophet and he is in Makkah. And the same place where he was raised, the same place where people looked up to him, and he had this great status, this great reputation. And suddenly overnight, he is being looked down upon. He is being called all kinds of derogatory names. And then, the few Muslims who choose to actually follow him, they start to face severe oppression and torture. And there's nothing that the Prophet can do, and there's nothing that Allah is doing. So Allah's not sending angels, Allah's not sending any kind of azab, nothing is happening. And then it's not even that like this is going on for a couple of years. On the contrary, it's actually going on for almost 12 years, and you don't see any relief coming from Allah. You don't see any angels being sent or anything that is being done to harm the oppressors, right? And then furthermore, you have an economic boycott. So the people of Quraysh, they have an economic boycott on Banu Hashim, the tribe of Muhammad, peace be upon him. And the boycott becomes so severe that the tribe is faced with severe hunger, famine. A lot of the women and children face death. And there's nothing that again can be done because the boycott lingers on for a few years. And again, you don't see any kind of ease that is coming from Allah during the time of the boycott. Allah could have ended the boycott in a couple of weeks or in a few months. He could have ended the boycott before anyone faced any form of death, but He did not. It went on for a few years. And then after that, when the Prophet ends up losing his beloved companion, his wife, Hazrat Khadija, and then subsequently he ends up losing his own uncle as well, Abu Talib, he decides to go to Taif. And he has this idea that maybe if I go to Taif, people over there might be able to embrace Islam and they might be able to give me the support that I need so we can allow Islam to grow. And Allah does not warn him about what's going to happen in Taif. So you see another setback. And in fact, this setback it's not just a failure, but it's humiliating because in the entire Arab region, everyone finds out that this man who's calling himself the messenger of God, he has been chased by children throwing stones at him. And he has been chased for kilometers, running out of the city for security, and he's bleeding profusely. And this is a prophet of God. So you can imagine the humiliation that is associated with something like this as well. And at the end of Taif, you see that was really the point of climax for Muhammad, peace be upon him. That is when he gave the beautiful prayer to Allah, where he said, "To you, my Lord, I complain only of my weakness." So I'm not complaining about you, I'm complaining to you. Right? That shows you that his mindset is such that he is complaining to his Lord, which is perfectly reasonable. That is perfectly allowed. And he says, Allah, I complain to you of my weakness, my lack of support, the humiliation that I have been made to receive. But he says, most compassionate and most merciful, you are the Lord of the weak and you are my Lord. And then he asks Allah questions. Allah, to whom do you leave me? To a distant person who is receiving me with such hostility, or to an enemy that you have given more power over me? So Taif was a complete humiliation. There's so much hostility. And at the same time, I cannot go back to Makkah because in Makkah, you've given the enemy more power than me. They have wealth, they have armies, they have everything, and I have nothing. And so, but he ends it by saying, Allah, as long as you are not displeased with me, I really don't care what I face. So in other words, it ends with this beautiful note that, yes, Allah, I'm complaining to you because I'm a human and you are my Lord. And you are my source of strength. So when we feel down and we feel very sad, it is perfectly allowed to complain to Allah and to ask Allah for help, to ask Allah for his assistance. But what you see towards the end of his prayer is there is a growth mindset. He's not saying, okay, Allah, well, that's it. I'm stuck now. So until you don't show me exactly what it is that you want, there's nothing I can do. So I'm just going to sit here and I'm just going to wait for you to open up some path for me. You don't see him saying, Allah, I'm exhausted. Or Allah, this life just seems to be very unfair. On the contrary, you see him reminding himself that Allah, as long as you are not unhappy, that's all that matters to me. Because the mission is still there. And that is to try and attain Jannah. To try and spread the message of positivity as much as I can. That mission is still there in his mind. And this is what you call a growth mindset. He's still looking for solutions. He's still looking for options that, okay, now I'm in this very terrible state. I'm very down and depressed. But what can I do? My mission is still there. I'm still a prophet. I still have to pass on the message to other people. How can I possibly do it now? You do not see a blame game that, Allah, you have done so much to me in the past, so many problems, so many setbacks, so much failure, that Allah, none of this was basically my fault. You did this to me, Allah. You put all these tests and difficulties upon me. So really it's not my fault. So Allah, what do you want from me? You don't see a blame game. You don't see the Prophet telling himself or believing in his heart that I am the product of all these setbacks and all of these tests and difficulties that I have faced. On the contrary, you see a man who has suffered for so many years with no support whatsoever, but still he's looking forward for solutions. And that is why the Prophet ends by saying, Allah, all that I'm concerned about is not the reason for my failures. It's not the reason, why my life was made so tough and difficult. All I'm concerned about is, Allah, give me the assurity that you are still happy with me. Give me the assurity that you are not displeased, because that's all that I require. As long as I know that my Lord is still happy, I'm going to keep struggling and keep coming up with solutions. That is the mindset of a human being. Yes, he was a prophet. Yes, he had great iman, but at the end of the day, he's a human just like you and me. That's the mindset that he had. Besides that, there's another beautiful example we see from Hazrat Yusuf alayhi salam. So those of you who might be acquainted, Hazrat Yusuf alayhi salam, when he was a young boy, he was thrown into the well by his brothers. They were incredibly jealous of him. And, subsequently he was then traded as being a slave, and he was sent to the place of Egypt. So he moved from Palestine to Egypt. And over there he was raised by this man and this woman. And eventually there was a series of setbacks that he faced, a series of tests and difficulties, and none of it was his fault. He did not choose to be thrown into the well. He did not choose to be traded as a slave. He didn't choose to be raised in Egypt. None of these things were choices that he made. Right? These were things that Allah had imposed upon him. All kinds of tests and difficulties. And over time, it just seemed to get worse and worse. You don't see a prolonged period of ease or, relief being given to him. But eventually, what we see is that towards the end of the story, this is the part that I found very, very surprising. Towards the end of the story, when Yusuf alayhi salam is finally reunited with his brothers, and he is reunited with his parents, and in specific, the father whom he was so close to, the father Yaqub alayhi salam, who was also a prophet at that time. When Yusuf alayhi salam sees that now my parents and my brothers are here, they are with me in Egypt, and they all do sajda to him as a sign of respect, the first thing that he tells his father is that you see extreme joy and happiness in his tone. And he tells his father that this is the fulfillment of the vision that I had before. Right? So in other words, before I was thrown into the well, I had this vision, I had this dream of the sun, moon, and the 11 stars prostrating to me. And now I see that vision actually being fulfilled. And then furthermore, he's talking to his father, by the way, who's a prophet, yes, but he's also a father. So this is a father and son private relationship. And being a son, of course, you can talk to your father, you can grieve, you can complain as well. It's perfectly something that would be understandable. This is not Yusuf alayhi salam giving a sermon to all of the people. This is him talking one-to-one private conversation with his dad. And he's allowed to grieve, right? He's allowed to complain. He can choose to play the blame game if he wants. He can choose to say, my childhood was taken away from me because of what my brothers did. My entire life was so difficult, and then my life, there was just no ease in it. It just became worse and worse. He could sit down and recall everything that happened and start playing that victim mentality, right? But he doesn't do it. On the contrary, he tells his father that Allah has been so kind to me when he rescued me from the prison, and he brought all of you out from the desert to this amazing city of Egypt, after Shaitan had sowed discord and enmity between me and my brothers. So what you see is that he's not focusing on the fact that he was thrown into the well. His childhood was practically taken away from him. He was put into Egypt, separated from his family. There was so much hatred that, his brothers had for him. Then he was put into a prison. He's not focusing on the tests and difficulties. He's focusing on all those moments when the tests were finally removed. So he's not addressing the fact that Allah put me in prison. He's focusing on the fact that Allah helped to get me out of prison. He's not focusing on the fact that it was through the will of Allah that I was thrown into a well and then taken away to Egypt. He's focusing on the fact that Allah has now reunited my entire family, and there is now love between me and my brothers when previously there had been so much anger and hatred. So what you see is that he's not playing the blame game at all. He's not choosing to live in the past. On the contrary, he's finding the silver lining in all of his tests and difficulties. He's looking back and he is seeing only the mercy of Allah. He doesn't see the problems. He doesn't see the failures. He doesn't see the setbacks. He just sees God's mercy. And this is not, again, someone who is an angel. This is a human being like you and me. He had more iman than us, absolutely, but he had the same components inside of him that me and you have. So if Yusuf alayhi salam had the ability of looking back into his difficult past and only seeing Allah's mercy, then that is the kind of mindset that he chose, which means if he can do it, then we can do it too. And furthermore, when you study his life and the kind of setbacks and difficulties that you face, you see a man who had a growth mindset. You see a man like Muhammad, peace be upon him, who's looking forward, who's not looking back, who's not saying that, okay, my life just seems to be getting worse, so I'm just going to sit in depression now. You see a man who keeps struggling, who keeps looking forward, even when he's in prison. He's not just sitting in depression in prison, he's doing tabligh. He's passing on the message of Allah. He's passing on the message of Islam, and he's trying to promote the love of God in the inmates in prison, which does not show you a man who is depressed or who's grieving. It shows you a man who still has hope that my life will get better. I just know it. You see that growth mindset where he's still looking for solutions. He's understanding, like Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that I have a mission. That mission is still there. I am a messenger of God. That cannot change. And so there is still something that I have to do. I will be questioned by Allah on the Day of Judgment, and I cannot simply say, Allah, I just gave up because my life was just too tough. On the contrary, I need to keep looking forward and come up with solutions, having this firm conviction that Allah's mercy has already come and it will continue coming. In fact, throughout the Quran, when you look at all of the other prophets as well, the more you examine their lives and their difficulties, the more you will understand how beautiful their growth mindset was and how they never played this blame game of living in the past. Nuh alayhi salam, after having done tabligh for 950 years to his nation, 950 years, this man was constantly propagating Islam. And at the end, when it was time for the azab, there were only 6 people who believed in him. There were only 6 people who were willing to follow him, and all 6 happened to be members of his own family. 3 sons and their 3 wives. His own wife, Nuh alayhi salam's own wife, she was not amongst the believers, and his 4th son, he was not from amongst the believers. So again, this was a pretty big test that he faced, 950 years, and at the end, this is all you have to show, 6 people. And all 6 people are from your family. But you don't see him moving in towards a complex. You don't see him blaming his life or blaming other people for the kind of situation that he's in. In fact, even when he found out that his 4th son has died in the azab and he cannot be saved because he was not from the believers, you see Nuh alayhi salam making a small request to Allah. And he makes this request pertaining to his 4th son, that Allah, you know that he is from my family. Sort of hoping that, maybe there might be something good for him. And Allah instantly reprimands him. Now, for a prophet who at the same time was, of course, a father, and he had so much love for all of his sons, including his 4th son, again, you don't see the victim mode. You don't see a blame game. You don't see him now living in the past and falling into grief. On the contrary, when the azab is over and the ark has now landed in this new place, which is Mount Judy, and now civilization has to start again, this man, Nuh alayhi salam, is continuing on with his message. He's now teaching his children, and then he's moving forward with positivity and hope instead of falling into depression. Isa alayhi salam is another brilliant example, because unlike the other prophets, Isa alayhi salam, being a Rasul, he was sent to his own people. He was not sent to a nation of disbelieving people. He was not sent to a nation of people who were worshipping idols. He was sent to the Jews. Being a Jew himself, he was sent to Jews. And these Jews were supposed to be the Muslims of that time. So Isa alayhi salam going to a community of over 1,100,000 Jews, you would expect that, he must have been given quite a bit of support. But at the end, with a nation of Muslims to whom you have been sent, and 1,100,000 or more of them, the only support that he got was from 12 disciples. That's it, just 12 people. And then his own community is trying to conspire against him, and they're calling him all kinds of names. And again, you don't see that victim mentality. He's not blaming anyone. He understands that his situation, his life is very tough because of the way that the other Jews are behaving. That much he understands. So he knows that the cause for the situation that he is in are the Jews and the way that they're behaving, but he's not blaming them. On the contrary, he keeps looking forward as to how can I further spread the message? How can I fulfill my mission of being the promised Messiah? How can I reinstate this ummah and give it back the power that it's supposed to have? That's all he's thinking. At no point do you see him depressed and grieving and in despair, giving up hope in the mercy of Allah. At no point do you see him complaining to Allah and saying, Allah, you did this to me. You have put me in this difficult situation. I am now propagating your message. I only have 12 people who are following me. So Allah, how can you possibly expect anything from me? You don't see any blame game happening, or you don't see him living in the past. He has a growth mindset and he's looking forward. And finally, before I end this first point of the blame game, I want to give the example of the Battle of Uhud. This is one of the best examples, and the reason I'm giving this one is because now I'm not talking about prophets. I'm talking about Sahabas. I'm talking about Muslims who were not receiving revelation through Jibreel. But at the same time, you see a growth mindset in them as well. So in the famous Battle of Uhud, we know that things went quite wrong for the Muslims. Initially, it was going great, everything was going fine, but then there were some archers who were told to not leave their post, and they ended up defying the orders of the Prophet, and they did leave their post, which caused the Muslims to be sandwiched between Khalid bin Walid's cavalry and the people of Quraysh. So they were sandwiched right in the middle, and they were fighting for their lives, and many, many things went wrong. Not only were the Muslims confused because they were initially winning, so they weren't sure how the victory was now turning into a defeat. Then there was confusion about the archers and why the archers left their post. And then while they're fighting for their lives, they're seeing many Sahabas embrace Shahadat. And for Muslims of weak iman, that's a very difficult time at that moment, to be sandwiched between the enemy and then to see some of your key Sahabas and key warriors embracing Shahadat. And then furthermore, this rumor spread in the battlefield that maybe Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, has passed away as well. So of course, when so many people are fighting, it's hard to see where the Prophet actually is. And so when the rumor spread, a lot of them thought, okay, our main leader, now he's passed away. And so, in that fear, many of them abandoned the Prophet and they went running up the Mount Uhud to save themselves. But the key thing that you see in this entire scenario is that not once does Allah send the angels to help the Muslims. Not once do the Muslims throw their swords, fall down in sajda and say, okay, Allah, we're exhausted, we're tired, we're sandwiched between the enemy, so please do something. Not once do you see them saying, okay, Allah, this isn't our fault. I mean, you have done this to us. The archers, they left their post. That's not our fault. People are fleeing from the battlefield. That's not our fault. So Allah, I'm sorry, there's nothing else we can do. You don't see them throwing their sword and giving up. On the contrary, while standing on the battlefield with so much going wrong, they're still thinking of solutions. They're still thinking, how can we save the Prophet? How can we protect him? How do we keep fighting without running away from the battlefield, because that's not allowed? How do we still end up winning this thing? That's all that was going on in their minds. That's what you call a growth mindset, and they were human beings just like us. There's no victim mentality, there's no blame game. Even after the Battle of Uhud ended and everyone knew what exactly had gone wrong, Allah had made it clear to the Muslims that nobody now blames the archers. Nobody should blame those who left the battlefield. Allah has forgiven them all, so there's no blame game that is allowed. On the contrary, learn from the past and try not to repeat those mistakes again, and that's it. Don't let this defeat define you. Don't let this setback define you or make you think any less of yourselves or any less of your capabilities. Keep looking forward and keep coming up with solutions. So this is the first thing that was being done by people in the past with regards to not playing the blame game, not living in the past, always looking forward. And the second most important thing, which I will just discuss over here briefly, because in the remaining lectures this has to be elaborated in a lot more detail, is the fact that the people in the past, the Sahabas and especially the Prophets, they were always reflecting using the Quran. That was the key reason that they never fell into grief. They never played the blame game. They never lived in the past. The main source of their energy was in fact the Quran. Now, let me explain what that means. Science has now proven that in our body, we actually have two minds. So there's a mind in the brain and there's a mind in the heart. And the key difference between both these minds is that the mind in the brain always thinks about the self. Okay, so it's always thinking about you. What do you need? What are your goals? What is important for your happiness? It's kind of oriented around the individual. But the mind and the heart is actually very different. The mind and the heart focuses on building relationships. It's about bonds. It's about loyalty and trust and loving other people. And most importantly, it has a spiritual component inside of it. And this component is not present anywhere else in the body. In other words, the ruh. The ruh is inside the heart. So while the mind of the heart, it yearns for other bonds and loyalty, trust, and other friendly relationships, the key relationship that it really yearns for and that it needs is the relationship with God. Now, in terms of the Quran, what we know is that Allah mentions this phrase, ulul albab. He mentions this many, many times. Ulul albab is talking about the people who use their albab. And albab comes from the word lub. So these are people who use their lub a lot. And Allah calls them the men of understanding. And He uses this phrase many, many times throughout the Quran. The idea being is that the people who use their lub are people who will be successful. They are people who will truly understand their mission. They will truly have happiness and contentment and peace in this dunya as well as in the akhirah. Now, the lub actually is something that is inside our heart. So when you look at the qalb, when you look at the heart, within the heart there is something which Allah refers to as the fuad. Fuad is really our emotional intelligence. So the fact that we can show compassion, mercy, justice, the kind of things that cannot be shown by animals, for instance, the things that make us a khalifa, that is all present in the fuad. Okay, and the fuad is the emotional intelligence present in the heart. Now within the fuad, which is really now the core, the center of the heart, is something which is called the lub. And the lub is really divine intellect. Or in other words, it's simply what we call wisdom. You understand there's a difference between knowledge and wisdom. So knowledge is just acquiring all kinds of information, but wisdom is when you really are able to decipher and understand the true hidden meaning. So if you are someone who has attained wisdom, then you are a person who has activated his lub. So you are amongst the ulul albab. And as a result, because your lub, the core of your heart, has been activated, that is like the main energy source. So your entire heart is bursting with positive energy. It's bursting with hope and love of God. And because, again, science has told us that the heart emits an electromagnetic energy field that is 5,000 times greater than that emitted by the brain. What that means is when your heart is bursting with nur, it's bursting with the love of God, then every cell in your body becomes rejuvenated. So every cell in your body is bursting with energy. And as a result, overall, from head to toe, you feel positive. Your physical and your mental health both improve. Your immune system itself actually improves because the core, which is the heart, has become energized. And it all became energized because you were able to activate the lub. So then, of course, the main question is, how do you activate the lub? How do we obtain wisdom? And this is where you look back at the prophets and you look back at the sahabas. They were human beings like us. But what is one thing that they were doing a lot? They used to reflect a lot on the words of God. They used to reflect and really ask the more important questions regarding all the verses that they would receive. So it's not like, they just heard it and they ignored it and moved on. They would really ponder and think hard. And the more you reflect and ponder, the more you try and find the hidden gems inside the message of Allah, inside the verses and the words of Allah. That's how you activate the lub. And once the lub is activated and that wisdom is there, it's like you see the world in an entirely different perspective. You are able to see your life, yourself, the different people around you, the different relationships that you have. You see them from an entirely different angle. And that changes your perspective about everything. And that's where the contentment and the peace comes in. Because then having things or not having things doesn't matter. So, for example, when you look at Surah Luqman in the Quran, Allah explains how this man called Luqman was able to just examine the environment, just, look around and look at the trees, the grass, the beautiful air, everything that Allah has created. And he kept asking very important questions, that why has Allah made all of this with so much perfection? What's the goal? What's the aim? What does Allah actually want from me? Is the idea that we simply acquire as much as we can, then we die and that's it? Or is there going to be some form of accountability? Is there some mission? Was there some reason that I was created? When I die and I'm standing in front of Allah, will Allah ask me about my degree? Will Allah ask me about my career and my promotion? Will Allah ask me about, how much success I faced in this dunya? Or perhaps is it that Allah is going to ask me an entirely different set of questions that I have not even considered? This is what it means to ponder and reflect. This is what activates the lobe. So really, activating the lobe is not something that only a scholar can do. It's not like someone who has studied, the Quran and Hadith for years, only he can do it. Anyone and everyone can do it, because everyone has a lobe. And everyone just has to start asking questions and ponder and reflect on the words of God. Try and find the hidden gems. Try and find the hidden meaning that is inside. And this is also the beauty of the Quran, that many things are very clear, but many things aren't. And the only way that you can find out about the message is by asking questions and digging deep. And that's what Allah is encouraging. So it's like He's hidden a treasure and He wants you to struggle really hard to find it. And in that struggle, you are able to end up finding yourself. You're able to see this dunya in a different perspective. You're able to understand your mission and your purpose while trying to attain that treasure. That struggle is in fact the most beautiful and the most important thing. This is what the prophets were doing. This is what the Sahabas were doing. It's not like, there was some sort of a miracle and Allah suddenly gave them the answers to all their questions. It's not like the day they were born with so much wisdom and so much knowledge of everything in the world. They had to acquire it. They had to strive for it. They had to work for it. And that is what activated their lub and gave them a heart that was filled with contentment and peace. And when we have that kind of a heart, then you don't want to blame anyone else. You want to look forward. You don't want to live in your past. You want to focus on your future. You want to focus on the day that you will be standing in front of Allah and a series of questions will be asked, so that you are not humiliated on that day because you've not done your homework. You just weren't prepared. And you realize finally that I will not be able to stand there and say, Allah, I didn't do anything for Islam because I was depressed, because I was living in the past. Or Allah, I wasn't able to do much because this person hurt my feelings. Or these people took away certain things from me. Or I was born in, this kind of an environment that it was hard for me to remain positive. These are excuses that we will not be able to give on the Day of Judgment. So for students nowadays who complain that, we procrastinate a lot, it's so hard for us to get up and do our prayers. It's so hard for us to study the Quran. We really try to, but then, something happens and for some reason we're just not able to. Or, our life has been so difficult, or we were raised in such a terrible way, or our childhood was so harsh for us. And because of all these reasons, we are what we are today, and it's so hard for us to connect to God. This is us playing that blame game. Understand that yes, maybe your life was tough. Maybe certain bad things did happen to you. Maybe the environment that you were raised in was very difficult. All of these things can be a cause for why we are facing setbacks today. They can be a cause for our current failure or our current tests and difficulties, but they cannot define us. They cannot limit us. They cannot constrain us in any way. They cannot stop us from still achieving something great or becoming something great. So when you start to blame all of these things for your life and you start living in the past, then you are choosing to limit yourself. You are convincing yourself that there's nothing more that you can achieve, so stop trying to find solutions. You are convincing yourself that your life will always be miserable and you will always be like this, and therefore you are choosing to live in grief. This is not something that Allah has done to you. And finally, remind yourself of the story of Iblis. When Iblis was condemned by Allah because he refused to prostrate, the first thing that he said in retaliation, in his defense, was that Allah, because you have done this to me, now I'm going to make sure that I misguide as many of your people as I possibly can. I will lie in wait for them and I will misguide them and move them away from the path of Islam. And the interesting thing you see is that he's blaming God. So now he's being thrown out of the heavens. He's being put into Jahannam. That is his final destination. Allah has cursed him. Allah is incredibly angry with him. And he's still blaming God. Not once do you see that Iblis ends up asking Allah for forgiveness. Not once do you see that Iblis makes the statement that, okay, Allah, I made a terrible mistake. I am very sorry, and now I understand that it was arrogance that was inside of me. He chooses to blame someone else for the setback that he is facing. And by blaming someone else, you are choosing to live in the past. You are choosing to let that setback define you and say, okay, this is what I'm always going to be like. So Iblis blamed God, and therefore by blaming God, he understood that therefore I'm always going to be like this. So I might as well as distract and misguide as many of mankind as I possibly can. This can be my perfect revenge. Without even realizing that regardless of how many people you misguide, you're still going to Jahannam. That's still your ultimate destination. So why not try and move forward by changing that outcome? Why not try and seek Allah's forgiveness? Why not try and admit that you've done something wrong? But he couldn't do it because he was living in the past, and he did that by choosing to blame someone else for a mistake that he had made. Instead of simply understanding that my jealousy that was inside of me was the cause of this entire setback, therefore I need to look forward and change myself, he decided that the best thing to do was blame God. And this is something now we all need to understand. May Allah make it easy for us to overcome our grief, our sadness and depression. May Allah make it easy for us to overcome our setbacks and the failures that we might have faced, so that instead of playing this blame game and living in the past, we are able to look forward. May Allah help us to adopt this growth mindset that the Prophets and the Sahabas had in the past, and may Allah make it easy for us to learn how to reflect on His word so we can activate our lub and we can have an energized heart, a heart that is filled with positivity. Assalamu alaikum.